Hi, it's John Kelly. In this module, we are going to discuss black letter disclosure. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, black letter disclosure means that as a preparer or an auditor, you make sure that every item that standards require to be disclosed is disclosed. And this is certainly something that regulators and inspectors and unhappy users insist upon. And I'll tell you a story about a time that a practice inspector insisted that we double underline certain items in a note in our financial statements. And they did that based on their interpretation of what professional standards required. Now, of course, there's nothing ever in professional standards that requires a number to be double underlined. And of course, they weren't our notes. We were the auditor. They were the notes that the preparer had developed. And it was incorrect to refer to them as our notes. But it was very, very clear to us that absolutely every item required by standards had to be disclosed in its complete glory. Now, standard setters actually think that black letter disclosure is bad. And when preparers and auditors disclose everything that is required by standards, that they're actually doing a bad thing. And they want preparers and auditors to omit certain disclosures if they can be argued to be immaterial because of a concern that too much disclosure of things that are perhaps immaterial will obscure the important disclosures. So then the question becomes, how does a preparer or an auditor argue that disclosure is immaterial and therefore can be omitted? And the problem is, of course, the definition of what is material in standards. Now let's look at the definition that the U.S. Supreme Court came up with for material. And they were dealing with a case where shareholders were being asked to vote on a transaction and certain information had been presented to them and some information had been omitted, and the people that prepared the information argued that it was not material, and of course the other side argued that it was material. And Thurgood Marshall, who spoke for the Supreme Court, this was 1976, said that an omitted fact is material if there is a substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would consider it important. And so the person that argued that the disclosure should have been there lost because he said, no, I don't think it was material because there wasn't a substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would have considered that important. And the concern that was expressed in the case back in 1976 was that if you required a high level of disclosure, that this might overwhelm shareholders with too much information and obscure or confuse the important information with the unimportant information. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission has a similar definition, a substantial likelihood that a reasonable investor would attach importance, and they are, of course, following the decision of the Supreme Court. International standards, on the other hand, set a much lower threshold for deciding whether something's important, and it says it could influence decision that users make. Now, could is a much lower threshold than would, and user, not specified reasonable investor, reasonable shareholder, and omitting the word reasonable. There are many, many, many users that international standards talk about and could influence the decision of any user. It's a very, very broad definition. After the fact, it makes almost anything material, and it makes it hard to omit anything. So I've kind of already done this, but the Supreme Court talks about substantial likelihood, and that's missing from international standards. And it talks about a reasonable shareholder or a reasonable investor, as opposed to professional standards which talk about any user and whether the user is reasonable or not, and use the word would as opposed to could. So I like the US Supreme Court definition, but as an auditor, I really don't want to have to go there to get the decision. I would like standards to make it clearer for me. So the international solution to this problem is they say they like the US definition, but still want to use the word could. And so the plan is to define could to mean the same thing as would reasonably. And that, unfortunately, I think is like arguing that an apple is an orangutan. So I don't think that's going to work. So in conclusion, some things that could help eliminate immaterial disclosure. Inspectors and regulators could help by stop requiring the black letter disclosure. Standard setters could help by coming up with a better definition of immaterial that couldn't later be challenged by an unhappy user. And until then, sadly, I think we as auditors and preparers are stuck with making sure that if professional standards require disclosure of something, we are going to disclose it. Because I think by definition, if standards require it, it's material. So, thanks for listening.